Disney's Pocahontas. Keep an eye on Meeko. Meeko was hungry, but he wasn't in the mood for fish, or for nuts, or for berries. He wanted something new. Meeko thought of Percy, the pampered pug dog. He always ate well. His menu included such things as leg of venison, grouse, and roast duck. It's time to pay Percy a visit, thought Meeko, rubbing his paws together. Meeko had no trouble finding Percy's tent once he reached Jamestown. Having belonged to the former governor, Ratcliffe, it was larger than the others. Now that Ratcliffe was on the way back to England, facing many years in prison, the tent belonged to Wiggins and Percy. Peeking inside, Meeko saw Wiggins toss a bone onto Percy's tin dish. "Bon appetit, Percy." Percy sniffed the bone. He stuck out his tongue in disgust. Table scraps. Wiggins leaned over and patted Percy. "What's the matter, Percy?" he asked. "Longing for your days in the sun with Governor Ratcliffe?" Percy closed his eyes dreamily. His head began to nod. "I long for those days too," Wiggins said. 2 months ago I was a respected manservant. Now I'm just a man." Percy bumped his nose on the dish. "But I suppose I'll get used to it," Wiggins said, "just as you'll get used to table scraps." Percy whimpered loudly. "Oh dear," muttered Wiggins. He leaned over and hugged Percy tight. "No, it's not easy without the governor," said Wiggins, "but we will survive." He swung his fist in the air. "All it takes is a positive attitude and lots of hard work." "Work?" Percy covered his head with his paws. "Cheer up, Percy," said Wiggins. "There are plenty of jobs for a dog to do." Wiggins jumped up on a stool. "Why, you can bravely lead a fox hunt through the woods. Tally-ho! You can pull a sled across the frozen ice with the strength of an ox. Mush, mush!" Percy stared up at Wiggins. "You can even protect the crops from pesky raccoons," Wiggins said. Meeko snickered. "As for me, I, too, will have a brand new purpose in life," Wiggins announced. He stopped to scratch his head. "I don't know what it is yet, but I shall find out." He jumped down from the stool and smoothed his jacket carefully. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Percy, new settlers are coming from England, and I am dying to welcome them." Wiggins paused at the doorway and smiled. "You know, Percy, I'm rather excited about our new lives, aren't you?" Percy looked down at the bone and snarled. Meeko stared at the bone, too, and licked his chops. It didn't look so bad. He had chosen his new friend wisely. When it came to food, this dog had connections. Speaking of connections, Meeko wondered if Wiggins was headed for the ship to stock up on more food. Meeko's sharp nose had begun to pick up scents of new and exciting treats. Dashing away from the tent, he followed his nose and his tummy all the way to the beach. Meeko stared out at the huge, hulking ship on the James River. The beach was dotted with members of the Powhatan tribe and settlers gazing at the billowing sails. One of those settlers was Wiggins, waving a white handkerchief. "Yoo-hoo, everyone!" Wiggins called to the passengers as they rowed small boats to shore. "Welcome to Jamestown, the gateway to the New World." Then something else caught Meeko's eye, and his nose. Sailors were unloading the tastiest-smelling barrels and sacks he had ever sniffed. A beefy man with a stubbly beard called out orders. It was Bill Bates, the overseer of the Jamestown storehouse. "Just drop the grub anywhere for now, men," Bates shouted heartily. To Meeko's delight, the sailors dropped the grub right in front of him. Meeko nibbled through a sack. He sputtered. "Flour! Ugh, not very tasty." Just as he was about to sample the next sack, he saw his friend Pocahontas running along the beach. She was running so fast that even Flit, her hummingbird friend, found it hard to keep up. His ears as sharp as his nose, Meeko could hear what Pocahontas was saying. "I wish Meeko were with us to welcome the ship, Flit," she called. "But he's probably off on one of his adventures." Meeko snickered as he hid behind the sacks. An adventure was right. "Welcome, good settlers." Meeko peeked out. It was Wiggins talking to a band of weary sailors. "Welcome to Jamestown, where you will find all the comforts of London." "Good," said a sailor with a red cap. "Then direct us to the nearest inn." Wiggins raised a long, skinny finger in the air. "That is, all the comforts except an inn." "No inn? What kind of new world is this?" cried a sailor with spectacles. Wiggins shrugged. "Very new. That's why we don't have an inn." Meeko saw Pocahontas walking toward Wiggins. Flit perched on her shoulder. "What is this thing you call an inn?" she asked. "Good day, Pocahontas," Wiggins said. "An inn is a house that welcomes weary travelers." "A house that welcomes weary travelers?" Pocahontas asked. "In my village, every house welcomes weary travelers." The sailor with the red cap looked worried. "If there is no inn, then where are we to stay?" Wiggins smiled. "Oh, you are so lucky, sir. A tent with a lovely view just became available." "A tent?" cried one sailor. "We want an inn," grumbled another. By the look on Wiggins' face, Meeko could see that he had a bright idea. "And you shall have one, gentlemen," Wiggins called above their angry voices. "Tomorrow I shall recruit some brawny men to build an inn." The sailor with spectacles walked over to Wiggins. "You know, you look a bit like an innkeeper, all neat and clean." "Yeah, the type of bloke who puts his food on a plate," a toothless sailor added. Wiggins puffed out his chest. "Innkeeper? As in keeper of the inn? As in jolly landlord?" he asked. This was it, his new purpose in life. He would be an innkeeper. Wiggins waved his gangly arms. "My inn will have the finest food and the finest guests, and I shall name it after the most important person in England." "King James!" the men shouted. "No!" Wiggins cried. He pulled a silver locket from under his shirt and flicked it open. Inside was a tiny portrait of a woman wearing a lace cap. Flit buzzed over to take a closer look. "My mother," Wiggins sighed, staring at the locket. "How I do miss her." The sailors dabbed their eyes. "We miss our mums, too." "Don't worry, my good men," Wiggins crooned. "My new inn will be as comforting as a mother's lullaby." They all began to howl. Meeko giggled. Suddenly he felt a strong hand grab his tail. "Gotcha!" It was Bates. Meeko chattered angrily as he felt himself being lifted in the air. "Hey!" Bates roared. "Look what I found nibbling in my sacks." Pocahontas gasped. "Meeko? Does this critter belong to you, missy?" Bates growled, swinging Meeko back and forth. Before Pocahontas could answer, Flit soared over to Bates and gave him a peck on the nose. "Arg!" he screamed, dropping Meeko. Meeko saw Pocahontas running toward him. Oh no! She must be furious with him for trying to steal food from the settlers. Meeko scampered down the beach, heading for the only safe place he knew, the enchanted glade. A week had passed. Meeko stayed hidden in the enchanted glade. He missed Pocahontas. Did she miss him too? No, she was probably still angry at him for trying to steal food. Meeko had another problem. He had eaten the food he'd stored in Grandmother Willow's trunk and was hungry again. Meeko wondered what Percy was eating at the moment. There was only one way to find out. The first thing Meeko saw when he reached Jamestown was the new inn. He stopped to watch as settlers hammered sturdy planks of wood into place. A bearded man stepped back to view the inn. "It's coming along, men!" "Aye," called a man from the top of a ladder. "All it needs is a roof." "And all I need is something to eat," thought Meeko as he continued on to Percy's tent. When Meeko peeked inside, he saw Wiggins standing before an easel. "A portrait of my mother will make the new inn complete," Wiggins said. Percy sat on a stool, wearing a lace cap, a huge rough collar, and a frock. Meeko giggled as the lace cap began to slip over Percy's eyes. "I'm sorry you have to model," Wiggins said, "but none of the men wanted to pose in a frock. I can't understand why." Wiggins reached for a juicy, meaty bone and waved it in the air. "Now, remember our agreement. You work for me until the portrait is completed, and this will be yours," Wiggins said. Percy stared at the bone, drooling all over his rough collar. Meeko's mouth was watering, too. He had come to the right place. "See, Percy?" Wiggins said. "I told you there was plenty of work for you to do." While Wiggins straightened Percy's cap, Meeko scurried into the tent and hid behind a chair. "And may I just say that for a dog, you look particularly fetching," Wiggins giggled as he ran back to the easel. Percy rolled his eyes. Now, the first brilliant brushstroke. Wiggins dipped his brush into a pot of paint. But all he got was a cloud of dust. He peered at the other paint pots. "Oh dear," he coughed. "The paints I brought from London have dried up." Wiggins headed for the doorway. "Percy, you sit perfectly still while I run to the storehouse for fresh paints. Don't even disturb a flea," Wiggins called over his shoulder as he ran out of the tent. He had to say the word flea. It would give any dog the urge to scratch. Meeko waved at Percy from behind the chair. Then he went over to the bone. Percy whined as he watched Meeko sniff his precious bone. Meeko decided to be polite. He held the bone out to Percy. But as Percy took the first bite, Meeko remembered the storehouse. If it had paints, it probably had other things. Yummy, tasty things. Dropping the bone, he dashed out of the tent and caught up with Wiggins at the storehouse. Meeko slipped behind a barrel. Oozing down the side of it was a stream of dark brown liquid. Meeko gave it a lick. It tasted gooey and wonderfully sweet. "Greetings, Bates, my good man," he heard Wiggins say. "I am in need of some paint for a masterpiece in the works." "Yeah, I've got paint." Bates grunted and picked his teeth with a splinter. "Smashing," said Wiggins. "Do show me your selection of hues." Bates picked up a bucket and clunked it on the table. "What's this?" asked Wiggins. "Paint." Wiggins shook his head. "This is a lovely tint of black. However, the shades I'm looking for are more in the yellow ochre, viridian green, and alizarin crimson range." Bates stared at Wiggins. "And the shades I carry are more in the black and brown range," growled Bates. By now, Meeko was halfway up the molasses barrel. "What kind of an establishment is this?" Wiggins demanded. Bates leaned over the table and glared at Wiggins. "Look, Michelangelo, this is Jamestown, Virginia, not Florence, Italy." "Well," said Wiggins. "Now take the paint or shove off," Bates shouted. Wiggins ran out of the storehouse. He would have to find paint elsewhere, but where? By now, Meeko had reached the top of the barrel. "You again!" Bates yelled. He headed toward Meeko. Meeko grinned and gave Bates a little wave. Then he jumped down and ran. "You verminous varlet!" Bates growled. "I'll get you for lurking around my molasses." He grabbed a turnip and hurled it at Meeko. Meeko dodged the turnip. He ran from the storehouse all the way back to the enchanted glade. The molasses would have to wait. As a frightened Meeko nestled deep in Grandmother Willow's branches, he knew it would be a while before he returned to Jamestown. "I can't wait to go swimming, Pocahontas," Meeko heard Pocahontas's friend Nakoma say. She and Pocahontas were walking toward Grandmother Willow and the river. "Last one in is a rotten pumpkin." Nakoma ran down to the river. But Pocahontas did not follow Nakoma. Instead, she stopped next to Grandmother Willow. "Wingapo!" "Hello, Grandmother Willow," said Pocahontas. The gnarled bark of the willow tree formed into a gentle smile. "Good day, dear," Grandmother Willow said softly. Grandmother Willow, Meeko has been away for so long. Do you know where he is? Pocahontas asked. Grandmother Willow's eyes widened. Meeko? Meeko gulped. Would Grandmother Willow keep his secret? Grandmother Willow's branches swayed slightly. Each creature must answer to its heart's desires, she said. Does this mean he's on another one of his adventures? Pocahontas asked. Grandmother Willow chuckled. Well, Meeko does seem to have an appetite. Meeko squeezed the branch he was sitting on. Please, please. For adventure. Meeko collapsed with relief. That's for sure, Pocahontas laughed. You know Meeko. Grandmother Willow glanced up. I certainly do. Pocahontas! Meeko saw Nakoma running up from the river. I thought you wanted to go swimming. I do, Pocahontas said. Shh, Nakoma hissed. Pepena ua elendam. Listen. To what? Asked Pocahontas. Meeko trembled. Had they heard him sneaking along the branch? Someone is crying, whispered Nakoma. The girls walked along the river until they came across Wiggins sitting on a stump. His face was buried in his hands, and he was sobbing loudly. Wiggins, what's wrong? Asked Pocahontas. Nakoma placed a hand on Wiggins' shoulder. Whatever it is, it can't be that bad. Wiggins looked up. That's easy for you to say, Wiggins blubbered. You never had to paint a portrait with no paint. No paint? In our village, we have all the colors of the rainbow, Pocahontas said. Wiggins stood up. Where did you find them? Tell me, please. In the forest, said Nakoma. We used the juices of fruits, vegetables, and roots. Meeko rolled on the branch and rubbed his tummy. Had she said fruits and vegetables? They make the most beautiful colors, Pocahontas added. Wiggins folded his hands. Ladies, would a demonstration be possible? It would be more than possible, Pocahontas smiled. Nakoma linked her arm through Wiggins. Come with us to our village. Meeko waited until the three of them were safely out of sight. Then he slid down the tree and ran for the village. Grandmother Willow was right. Each creature must answer to its heart's desires, and right now, his heart desired juicy fruits and vegetables. Meeko stood before the jugs of paint the girls had brought outside. He sniffed. Pokeberry juice and beet juice. Juices weren't bad. Not as good as fruit, but... The paint is over here, Wiggins! It was Pocahontas. Meeko dived into a jug. It was dark inside, but he was up to his neck in tasty blackberry juice. These colors are fantastic, Wiggins cried as Nakoma poured a vivid blue liquid into a clay bowl. Simply fantastic. We told you, said Nakoma. As they admired the paints, the friends were joined by Pocahontas's father, Chief Powhatan. Wiggins jumped up and bowed. Chief Powhatan, it is an honor. Powhatan raised his hand. Wingapo. Hello, Wiggins. Nakoma and I are helping Wiggins choose paints for his new inn, father, said Pocahontas. Ah, yes, the inn, Powhatan said. The chief of the Powhatan people knows of my inn? Wiggins cried happily. Powhatan nodded. Having one house to welcome many travelers. Yes, 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 asked Wiggins. Is like having one raindrop to freshen many trees. Inside the jug, Meeko giggled. But if an inn is what your people desire, may it bring you good fortune and great joy, Powhatan smiled. Why, thank you, Wiggins said. I hope you and your people will attend the grand opening of my inn. Grand opening? Asked Powhatan. Wiggins nodded. I will present a portrait of my mother and a feast. Meeko's ears perked up. Wiggins sighed. Too bad a traditional English feast is out of the question. Why? Asked Nakoma. Wiggins choked back a sob. How can I prepare Yorkshire pudding, Stilton cheese, and roast beef when there are no cows in Virginia? Then prepare something else, Pocahontas suggested. like baked squash stuffed with nuts and topped with maple syrup. Meeko hoped they wouldn't see his jug trembling. Wiggins smiled. Lovely. Powhatan spread his arms wide. Our land is full of wonderful foods, Wiggins. Wiggins turned to Pocahontas and Nakoma. Will you help me prepare the feast, pretty please? Of course we will, Wiggins, said Pocahontas. Mother Wiggins would be so proud of me. Why, she'd... Wiggins froze. Percy, he gasped. I forgot about Percy. He's been posing for hours. As Wiggins raced from the village, he knocked over the jug filled with the blackberry juice, and Meeko spilled out. He shook the juice from his fur. It splattered all over Pocahontas. Meeko! She shrieked. Uh-oh, thought Meeko. Pocahontas is really mad at me now. Meeko dashed out of the village. That night, Meeko dreamed about molasses. When he woke the next morning, he wanted molasses so badly it hurt. Returning to the storehouse was risky, but Meeko decided to live dangerously. He climbed down from Grandmother Willow and bravely set off for Jamestown. He was on a molasses mission, and no one was going to stop him. He broke into a run and was soon outside the storehouse. Meeko peeked out from behind a tree. He watched Bates leave the storehouse, his musket resting on his shoulder. The coast was clear. Meeko boldly entered the storehouse and headed for the molasses barrel. Soon he was standing on the rim, gazing down into the delicious goo. But as he stuck his paw into the molasses, he heard Bates whistling outside. Meeko shuddered. He didn't want to be caught molasses-handed. Dizzy with fear, Meeko teetered back and forth and then fell into the sticky molasses with a splat. Bates heard the noise and came running into the storehouse. Come out with your hands up, thief, he shouted. Meeko heard a click, then a bang. He vaulted from the barrel and landed in a sack filled with tea leaves. He crawled out of the sack, the leaves clinging to his fur. Cheese and crackers, Bates shouted when he saw the bristly creature. What in the king's name is that? Bates began to reload his musket. Meeko thought fast. He ran behind the molasses barrel and shoved. It tipped over, covering the floor with sticky molasses. Bates tried to chase Meeko, but his boots stuck to the floor. I'll get you yet, you little gargoyle! Meeko ran from the storehouse, giggling. Bates was in a very sticky situation. Meeko's heart pounded as he scurried up to the highest branch on Grandmother Willow. He caught his breath, then heard the sound of feet crunching on the leaves below. It was Pocahontas. Wiggins, she was saying, you're making a big mistake. Meeko gazed down and saw Pocahontas running after Wiggins. He had an axe. Why do you have to cut down this tree, Wiggins? Pocahontas demanded. I told you, Wiggins sighed. Willow branches are perfect for weaving chairs. Mother loves woven chairs. Can't you just sit on crates and barrels? Pocahontas asked. Wiggins rolled his eyes. Oh, Pocahontas. Wooden furniture is so Elizabethan. He raised his axe, ready to chop. You can't cut into this tree, screamed Pocahontas. This is a magic tree. My dear girl, your superstitions are so amusing, Wiggins chuckled. Now, if you'll excuse me, he said, my inn won't be finished until it's furnished. Not if I can help it, thought Meeko. He could feel his fur trying to stand up under the molasses. He took a flying leap and landed in front of Wiggins. Wiggins stared down at the strange bristling creature and shrieked. Eek! What is that? He dropped the axe. Pocahontas wrinkled her nose. I have no idea. It's part animal, part bush. Meeko chattered angrily and moved toward Wiggins. Wiggins stared at the moving bush, then up at the willow tree. You know, with a few tufted cushions, barrel chairs could look quite fabulous, he said. Suddenly Bates came crashing through the trees with his musket. There you are, you shrub with a tail. Pocahontas looked into the bush creature's eyes. She smiled. Meeko! She cried happily. Meeko leaped into Pocahontas's arms. I'll save you, missy, Bates said. He aimed his musket at Meeko. "Don't you dare hurt my friend!" Bates lowered his musket and glared at Pocahontas. "Your friend has been nibbling my provisions." "Meeko!" Pocahontas frowned. Meeko shrugged. "And if you don't stop him, I'm going to have to do the job myself." Bates patted his musket. "Don't worry," said Pocahontas. "I'll take care of him from now on." Meeko snuggled up to Pocahontas as she hugged him close. "Oh, Meeko," Pocahontas said, "I missed you so much." Meeko's heart soared. Pocahontas wasn't mad at him after all. Bates and Wiggins scratched their heads as Pocahontas cradled the bush creature. "And why are you so sticky? You need a nice long swim to clean you up." Meeko smiled. A few days later, Pocahontas placed Meeko in a basket outside her house. "This is for your own good," she said. Meeko peered out through the holes in the basket. "Now, you be a good raccoon while I go to the grand opening of the inn." She tied the lid down with 2 pieces of vine. "Pocahontas," her father called, "we must not be late." "Coming, father," said Pocahontas. Nakoma came up to them. She was holding a basket of baked yams. "Wiggins asked me to bake these. He wants plenty of food for the feast." Meeko's body quivered at the sound of the word feast. "Keep an eye on Meeko, Flit," called Pocahontas as they left the village. Flit buzzed over the basket, puffing out his chest. Meeko didn't waste any time. He clawed a hole in the basket big enough for his paws. Then he reached out and untied the vines. The lid popped open and Meeko was free. Flit tried driving Meeko back into the basket, but with a flick of his tail, Meeko flipped the basket over Flit. As he ran from the village, Meeko could hear Flit's wings batting angrily against the sides of the basket. There wasn't much time left for Meeko to beat Pocahontas and the others to the inn. He looked up at the trees and smiled. If they were taking the low road, he'd take the high road. By racing along the branches from one tree to another, Meeko reached Jamestown in time for the grand opening of the Mother Wiggins Inn. Dressed in velvet and wearing a plumed hat, Wiggins stood on the steps of the inn addressing the crowd. The guests yawned and shuffled in their places. "You know, this inn reminds me of a joke I once heard," he told the crowd. "There was this innkeeper, and his mother-in-law was coming to stay." No one saw Meeko sneak into the inn through a window. The first thing he spotted was the easel. It was surrounded with flowers and draped with a white cloth. He walked over and gave the easel a sniff. He smelled berries. He climbed up under the white cloth and licked Mother Wiggins' face. The canvas tasted like berries. He began to nibble the canvas. Percy strolled into the room. Meeko's tail was swinging from under the cloth. Percy growled. Meeko jumped down. He waved at Percy, then followed his nose to the dining room. It was a ravenous raccoon's dream come true. A long wooden table was set with tureens of squash soup and platters of baked fish, quail, and nuts. What a spread! Percy opened his mouth to bark for Wiggins. Meeko knocked a sweet potato biscuit onto the floor. Percy wagged his tail. Wiggins would have to wait. Meeko tossed Percy an ear of steamed corn. He could hear Wiggins outside, still giving his speech. "And now I would like to recite my poem, 'A Town Without an Inn.'" The crowd groaned. Wiggins cleared his throat. "A town without an inn is like a face without a smile. An inn says to the world, 'Come, stay with me and—'" "Hey, Wiggins!" called the sailor. "Feed us the grub or we'll dunk you in the river." Wiggins wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I say," he laughed nervously, "let's begin the festivities, shall we?" Meeko and Percy heard Wiggins lead the guests through the front door. They scurried for cover. "Welcome to the Mother Wiggins Inn," said Wiggins. "If you can write your name, please sign the guest book." The guests looked around the inn and nodded their approval. It was small but cozy. The sleeping chamber had beds with pine needle mattresses hugging the walls. The chairs were made from barrels and the curtains from sacks. Fresh flowers and lighted candles were everywhere. "You'll find the rates quite reasonable," Wiggins told the crowd. He turned to the draped easel. "But before you all rush to check in, let us unveil the portrait." Wiggins grabbed a corner of the drape covering the painting. "Friends, you'll sail 1,000,000 miles for one of her smiles. My—" He whipped off the cloth and gasped. Mother Wiggins' face was full of blotches and holes. "Mummy?" he whispered. "Your mother was attacked by many arrows," said Powhatan. No one noticed Meeko behind the portrait, peeking out through the holes where Mother Wiggins' eyes used to be. "I say we eat," growled Bates. "Brilliant idea," Wiggins cried. He stood up straight and waved the crowd into the dining room. "Ladies and gentlemen, dinner is being served," he announced. Wiggins froze when he saw the table. It was littered with bones, corn cobs, and nutshells. "Leftovers," mumbled Powhatan. Bates marched over to Pocahontas. "I'll bet it's the work of that pesky creature of yours." "If you mean Meeko, he's in a basket in the village," Pocahontas said. Wiggins forced a laugh. "Okay, so some critters got into the fritters. We still have a lovely stuffed turkey coming up." Wiggins reached for the lid, covering a silver platter. He yanked off the lid and shrieked. Percy was lying on a bed of wild rice, chewing on a drumstick. "Percy?" Wiggins gulped. "Aha! The culprit!" Bates shouted. "Stand aside. I'll blast him with my musket." Wiggins grabbed Percy. "There is no need for that." "Then what are you going to do with him, Wiggins?" Bates snarled. Wiggins tossed Percy into the arms of a young sailor. "Take him out and tie him up," Wiggins said. "I'll deal with him in the morning." As the sailor carried Percy out of the inn, Wiggins turned to his guests. "What can I say?" he chuckled weakly. Bates grabbed Wiggins by the collar. "I say we tie up the innkeeper if he doesn't serve us dinner." Nakoma smiled and held up her basket. "Yams, anyone?" As soon as he saw everyone eating, Meeko slipped down from behind the portrait and walked outside. There was Percy, tied to a tree with a long rope. Meeko sadly handed Percy a sweet potato biscuit, then made his way back to the village. Pocahontas lifted Meeko from the basket. "You didn't miss anything," she said. "Wiggins told bad jokes, and all we ate were yams. Nobody even wanted to stay at the inn." Flit glared at Meeko. Pocahontas was right. He hadn't missed anything. Pocahontas stretched out on her mat and yawned. "It's been a long day. Good night, Meeko. Good night, Flit." Flit closed his eyes and went to sleep. Meeko curled up in a bowl. He tried to sleep, but his nose began to tickle. What was that strange smell? It didn't smell like corn, or yams, or berries. His tail shot straight out. It was smoke! He ran to Pocahontas and tickled her feet with his tail. "It's too late to play, Meeko," mumbled Pocahontas. "Go back to sleep." Meeko dashed out. He stuck his nose inside each house. Where was that smoke coming from? None of the home fires were big enough to make such a strong smell of smoke. It had to be coming from a big fire elsewhere. Meeko weaved his way through the forest until he reached Jamestown. The smoke was coming from the inn. It was on fire. Percy was sound asleep. Meeko tickled him. Percy woke up and growled. But then he saw the smoke and let out a howl. Meeko chewed through the rope until Percy was free. Kicking up dust, Percy bolted through the settlement with ear-slitting barks. "Put a cork in that mutt," Bates snarled as he came out of his tent. But then he saw the smoke. "Cheese and crackers! The inn is on fire!" The settlers came out of their tents, wondering what the noise was all about. Percy could be heard as far away as Pocahontas's village. Soon everyone was rushing to the burning inn. Meeko stood next to Pocahontas as she watched the flames. "It's a good thing there's no one inside the inn," Pocahontas said. "Except the innkeeper," Bates said. Pocahontas turned to Bates. "What do you mean?" Wiggins insisted on staying in the inn, guests or no guests, Bates sighed. Poor unfortunate soul. Wiggins is in there? Pocahontas cried. Oh no! Meeko! Flit! Come back! Cried Pocahontas as Flit soared and Meeko jumped through an open window. Wiggins was fast asleep and snoring. Meeko tried tickling him awake, but it was no use. Flit had a better idea. Aiming his beak at Wiggins' big toe, he dived. Ow! Yelled Wiggins, bounding out of bed. He saw the clouds of smoke at his feet and screamed. Someone help me! He shouted from the ledge of his window. I can't jump! I'm afraid of heights! He's on the ground floor, a settler muttered. With a gentle push from Meeko, Wiggins jumped from the window, landing on the ground with a plop. He was followed by Meeko and Flit. My inn! My beautiful inn! Wiggins wailed. And it's my own fault. I left too many candles burning near the curtains. Powhatan stepped forward. Don't stand there like trees, he roared at the crowd. Get some water. But how will we carry it up from the river? A young settler asked. With clay pots from the village, shouted Pocahontas. And buckets from the storehouse, shouted Bates. He raised his fists in the air. Let the bucket brigade begin. Before long, a line had formed from the river to the inn. Pots and buckets full of water were passed from one set of hands to another. Stand next to me, Pocahontas, called Nakoma. She grabbed Pocahontas's hand. Okay, Pocahontas said. Side by side, the girls helped put out the fire. When it was finally out, the end was nothing but a pile of charred wood. Wiggins knelt in front of the rubble and wept. I could have been somebody. I could have been an innkeeper. Pocahontas stood over Wiggins. You still are an innkeeper, she said. But I have no inn. When a leaf falls from a tree, another one grows in its place, Pocahontas said. Wiggins gazed up at Pocahontas. Aye, a sailor called out. When a sail falls from the mainmast, you hoist it back up. Wiggins choked back a sob. Are you telling me we should rebuild the inn? The crowd cheered. Wiggins tapped his chin. Mother Wiggins always told me never to give up. Your mother sounds like a very wise woman, said Powhatan. Wiggins jumped up and waved his lanky arms. My next inn will have the finest food and the finest guests, and the grand opening will be even grander than the first. Just make sure these critters don't show up again, Wiggins, Bates growled, lifting Meeko and Percy by the scruffs of their necks. Wiggins raised an eyebrow. My good man, Bates, if you recall, it was Meeko here who saved my life. Flit buzzed over to Wiggins and stared into his eyes. Together with Flit, of course. And it was Percy who warned us about the fire, said Pocahontas. Bates put Meeko and Percy down. At the next feast, Wiggins said, these three will be my guests of honor. Meeko, Percy, and Flit bowed their heads graciously. As the weary people returned home, Wiggins scratched Percy behind the ears. You see, Percy, life in the New World is going to be just fine. Percy wagged his tail happily. Side by side, they walked back to their old tent. By the way, Percy, said Wiggins, have you ever heard the joke about the innkeeper's mother-in-law? Meeko smiled. This wasn't just the start of a new life. It was the start of a beautiful new friendship. He ran to catch up with Pocahontas, Nakoma, and Flit. Friends were the most important thing in the world, even better than molasses.